There's a specific kind of suffering that no one warns you about when you start the journey of becoming yourself. It's not the pain of trauma or loss or failure. Those, at least, people understand. This is something far more disorienting. It's the pain of watching yourself become unrecognizable to the people who thought they knew you. The pain of outgrowing relationships you were certain would last forever. The pain of realizing that the entire life you built while you were asleep no longer fits the person who's waking up. And the worst part isn't the transformation itself. It's that everyone around you will interpret your healing as your destruction. Carl Jung spent decades studying people going through exactly this. What he discovered was deeply unsettling, and it's something the self-help world still refuses to say out loud. The pain of becoming your true self isn't a sign that something's going wrong. It's proof that something's finally going right. But that knowledge doesn't make it hurt less. Because the reason this particular suffering cuts so deep is that everyone you love, your family, your partner, your closest friends, will look at your transformation and see betrayal. They'll see mental breakdown. They'll see you becoming a worse version of yourself, when actually, for the first time in your life, you're becoming real. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming who you actually are, rather than who you were conditioned to be. And he was adamant about something most therapists still won't tell you. Most people never complete this process, not because they lack courage, and not because they aren't smart enough to see what's happening. They abandon it because the pain becomes unbearable, not physical pain, something worse. The pain of being completely misunderstood by everyone you love. The pain of disappointing people who preferred your false self. The pain of standing alone in your truth while the entire world demands you return to the comfortable lie you used to perform so well. Today I'm going to walk you through why becoming yourself is the most painful thing you'll ever do. According to what Jung observed in decades of clinical work, the specific stages of suffering you'll move through on this journey, why the people closest to you will fight hardest against your transformation, and how to survive the death of who you used to be so you can finally live as who you actually are. Jung's understanding of individuation began with a simple observation that changed psychology forever. He noticed something strange about his patients who were making genuine progress, the ones who were actually healing, rather than just learning to cope more efficiently. They went through a predictable pattern of losses. They'd lose friends who couldn't accept the changes. They'd lose family relationships built on dynamics that required their silence. They'd lose careers that only worked when they performed a false version of themselves. They'd lose belief systems that no longer aligned with their emerging truth. And these weren't small losses. These were the foundations of their entire lives crumbling beneath them. What devastated these patients wasn't that they wanted to hold on to what they were losing. It was what the losing forced them to confront. They'd spent years, sometimes decades, building an entire life around a person who wasn't real. The job, the relationships, the reputation, the daily routines, the entire architecture of their existence. All of it had been constructed to accommodate a false self. And now that the true self was emerging, pushing through like a root through concrete, the entire structure was collapsing. Not because the true self was destructive, because the structure was never built for the truth. What made this process so agonizing was that it looked like pure destruction to everyone watching. The person who'd always been agreeable suddenly had boundaries. The person who'd always been available suddenly needed solitude. The person who'd always gone along with everything suddenly started saying no and meaning it. And the people who had benefited from the false self, who had built their own comfort around that performance, interpreted every single change as damage, as selfishness, as the person becoming lost. But Jung saw something entirely different. He recognized that what looked like breakdown was actually breakthrough. The person wasn't falling apart. The false structure was falling apart. And underneath it, something authentic was finally able to breathe. But that emergence required the complete death of the identity everyone had known. And death, even the death of something that was never real to begin with, is agonizing. Jung identified the first stage of this pain as what we might call recognition shock. This is the moment when you suddenly see, with devastating clarity, how much of your life has been performance. How many of your choices weren't actually yours. How many of your relationships are based on who you were pretending to be rather than who you are. How much of your personality is just a collection of learned responses to other people's needs and expectations. And this recognition doesn't arrive gradually, the way wisdom is supposed to. It hits like psychological lightning. One moment you're living your normal life. The next moment you're watching yourself from the outside, seeing the performance, seeing the adaptation, seeing the falseness woven through everything. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. That's the shock. You've been shown something about your own life that you can no longer deny. And that single piece of knowledge changes the meaning of everything. Jung observed that people in recognition, shock often felt like they were losing their minds. Because the life that felt completely normal yesterday suddenly feels like a stage set today. The relationships that felt meaningful suddenly feel hollow. The identity you've been performing suddenly feels like a costume you can't rip off fast enough. And everyone around you is still treating you like the person you were yesterday, the person you now realize you never actually were. This creates an immediate crisis. Do you tell people what you're seeing? Most people in recognition shock make the mistake of trying to explain. They sit down with their partner and try to articulate that they've been performing in the relationship for years. They tell their parents they've been living to meet expectations that were never theirs. They confess to friends that they don't even know who they really are because they've been too busy being who everyone needed them to be. And the response is almost always the same. Confusion, defensiveness, accusations that you're having a crisis, that you're being dramatic, that this will pass if you just calm down and go back to normal. Because the people around you aren't seeing what you're seeing. To them, you were perfectly fine until suddenly you weren't. They don't understand that you were never fine. You were just performing fine so convincingly that everyone believed it, including you. Jung found that this inability to communicate the recognition deepened the pain exponentially. You're seeing clearly for the first time in your life, and that very clarity is isolating you from everyone who's still operating in the dark. You want desperately for someone to understand what you're experiencing, but understanding would require them to question their own lives in ways most people aren't willing to do. So, instead of validation, you get concern. Instead of support, you get pressure to go back to who you were. And going back is exactly what you can't do anymore. The second stage Jung identified was dissolution, the phase where you begin dismantling the false life you built. You can't pretend anymore. The performance has become physically unbearable. You can't maintain relationships that require your false self to function. So you start making changes. And every single change feels like an amputation. because you're cutting away parts of your life that everyone else still sees as perfectly healthy. You leave the career that looked successful but made you feel hollow every single morning. You create distance in friendships that were draining you dry while calling it loyalty. You stop participating in family dynamics that required your silence as the price of belonging. You end the relationship that only worked when you made yourself smaller. And with every change, the accusations intensify. You're being selfish. You're throwing away everything good in your life. You're not thinking clearly. You're hurting people who love you. But here's what Jung understood, that the people saying these things don't. These changes aren't destructive. They're necessary amputations of a life that was never yours. When you've built everything around a false self, every piece of that life is connected to the falseness. The job exists because the false self chose it. The relationships function because the false self maintains them. The entire structure depends on you continuing the performance night and day. So, when you stop performing, the structure doesn't just weaken, it collapses. It has to collapse, because it was never built to hold who you actually are. The pain of dissolution isn't just about losing what's in front of you. It's about confronting how much time you've already lost, living a life that wasn't yours. Jung recognized this as retroactive grief, mourning not just the present losses, but all the years you spent being someone you weren't. All the times you suppressed your truth to keep the peace. All the moments you betrayed yourself so quietly that no one noticed, not even you. All the choices you made from fear rather than authenticity. In dissolution, you feel all of it at once. The backlog of unfelt pain hits you like a wave you never saw coming, and it is crushing. During dissolution, Jung observed that people often felt utterly alone because you're tearing down your life in real time while everyone watches in horror. Your family thinks you're having a breakdown. Your friends think you're making catastrophic decisions. Your partner thinks you're becoming someone they don't recognize. And they're right about that last part. You are becoming someone they don't recognize because they never knew your true self. They only knew your performance, and your performance is dying in front of them. This is where many people abort the individuation process entirely. The pain of being misunderstood by everyone becomes unbearable. The isolation feels too extreme. The loss feels too vast. So they reconstruct a version of the false self, maybe a slightly modified version, but false nonetheless. They return to performing. They convince everyone they're better now. But Jung warned that aborting individuation creates a specific kind of psychological death that's worse than the pain they were running from. You'll spend the rest of your life knowing who you actually are while pretending to be someone else. And that split, that daily, hourly self-betrayal, will slowly destroy you from the inside in ways no one can see. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get true self-discovery. The third stage Jung documented was what I'll call the void, the terrifying space between who you were and who you're becoming. You've dismantled the false life, but the authentic life hasn't emerged yet. You're not the person you were, but you have no idea who you are. You're suspended in complete liminal space. And this space is terrifying because there is absolutely nothing to hold on to. Jung found that the void was where people experienced the most intense psychological distress of the entire process. Because humans need identity the way they need oxygen. We need to know who we are. We need roles, labels, structures that tell us where we fit and what we're supposed to do. And in the void, all of that is gone. You're not the dutiful daughter anymore. You're not the successful professional. You're not the reliable friend. You're not the accommodating partner. You've shed every identity you ever wore, and there's nothing underneath yet. Just raw, unformed, terrifying potential that feels like emptiness. People in the void often described feeling like they were literally disappearing, like they were watching their personality dissolve into nothing, like they didn't know what they liked, what they wanted, what they believed, who they were attracted to, what kind of life they even wanted to build. Everything that had felt solid and certain about their identity had liquefied, and they were floating in this formless darkness with no anchor, no map, no sense of direction. But Jung insisted this void was not just normal, it was essential. You cannot become your true self by modifying your false self. You can't renovate a house built on a cracked foundation. You have to tear the whole thing down so something real can be built from the ground up. The void is the fertile darkness where your authentic self is gestating. But you can't rush gestation. You can't force what isn't ready. You have to endure not knowing who you are until who you actually are reveals itself in its own time. The pain of the void isn't dramatic or explosive. It's a quiet, relentless ache of groundlessness. You wake up and don't know how to be. You move through your day without the scripts you used to follow. You interact with people but can't play the old roles. Everything feels exhausting because you're not operating from any established identity anymore. You're improvising your own existence from moment to moment, building the plane while you're flying it. And the effort of that is unlike anything you've experienced before. Jung observed that people who couldn't tolerate the void would grab at a new identity just to fill the emptiness. They'd construct a new persona, often a spiritual one or a radically different lifestyle, just to escape the formlessness. But this was another trap. A constructed identity, even a shiny new one, is still false. True individuation requires sitting in the void, in the not knowing, until your authentic self emerges on its own terms. And that emergence cannot be manufactured or accelerated, no matter how desperately you want it to be. The fourth stage Jung identified was integration, when your true self finally starts to take shape. This isn't the triumphant cinematic moment you might imagine. It's subtle, almost imperceptible at first. You start noticing preferences you didn't know you had, boundaries that feel natural instead of forced, desires that rise from genuine depth rather than from what you think you should want. You're not constructing a new identity. You're discovering the one that was buried underneath decades of conditioning and performance. But here's what makes integration painful in its own way. Your true self will almost certainly disappoint everyone who knew and needed your false self, because your false self was engineered to please others, to meet expectations, to avoid conflict at all costs. Your true self carries no such programming. Your true self might be quieter than people expect, or much louder, might want completely different things from life, might hold values that directly conflict with your family's, might need far more solitude than anyone is comfortable with, might be less accommodating, less nice, less available, more honest, more boundaried, more selfish in ways that are actually, finally healthy. And people will hate this version of you. Jung documented that integration was when relationships reach their ultimate crisis point. Because now you're not just dissolving the old self, you're actively showing up as someone new. Someone who doesn't fit the roles others assigned you before you could even speak. Someone who won't perform for approval anymore. Someone who prioritizes their own truth over everyone else's comfort. And this makes you dangerous to anyone whose life was built around your compliance. Your family will say you've changed for the worse. Your partner will say you're not the person they fell in love with, and they're absolutely right, because they fell in love with a performance you can no longer sustain. Your friends will call you selfish, and from their vantage point, they're correct, because you've stopped centering their needs above your own survival. Every relationship that was built on the foundation of your false self will either transform completely or it will end. And Jung observed that most of them end. This is the loneliest passage of individuation. You're finally becoming real, and that realness is costing you everyone who preferred the version of you that wasn't. You're finally honoring yourself, and that self-honor is being read as betrayal by the people you love most. You're finally living authentically, and that authenticity is alienating you from nearly everyone in your life. Jung called this the price of consciousness. And he was unambiguous that most people, when they see the full invoice, decide the price is too high and go back to sleep. But some people pay it, not because they're stronger or more courageous than everyone else, because they've reached a point of no return where they'd rather lose every person in their life than lose themselves one more time. They've spent so long being false that even complete isolation feels more bearable than returning to the performance. This isn't noble or romantic, it's survival. They've recognized in their bones that continuing to perform the false self is a form of slow psychological suicide, and they'd rather be completely alone and real than surrounded by people and fake. Jung observed that people who made it through integration emerged as fundamentally different beings. Not different in their core essence, that had always been there, waiting. Different in their willingness to live it without apology. They stopped managing other people's perceptions of them, stopped explaining themselves to people who were determined to misunderstand, stopped trying to shrink themselves to fit into spaces that required them to be smaller, quieter, or more obedient than was true. The final stage Jung identified was sovereignty. When you're established in your true self and the reactions of others no longer destabilize you, you're not trying to prove anything to anyone, not trying to justify your transformation, not trying to get a single person to understand what you went through. You've accepted that most people won't, that your family may never approve, that your old friends may never come back, that your partner may not be capable of loving the person you actually are. And you're at peace with that. Not because it doesn't sting, because you finally understood at the deepest level that their approval was never worth your disappearance. Jung found that people who reached sovereignty possessed a quality that deeply unsettled others. They were comfortable with disapproval. They didn't need consensus. They didn't need validation. They could hear criticism without being shattered by it. They could be completely misunderstood without feeling compelled to correct the record. They had built an internal source of authority so solid that external pressure simply had nowhere to land. This looked like arrogance to people still performing for approval. How dare you not care what people think? How dare you sit so comfortably in choices that others condemn? But Jung knew this wasn't arrogance at all. This was wholeness. The person had internalized their own authority so completely that other people's judgments became background noise rather than a crisis. Sovereignty doesn't mean the pain vanishes forever. You'll still feel the absence of relationships that couldn't survive your transformation. You'll still have nights where doubt creeps in and whispers that maybe you destroyed everything good in your life. You'll still encounter people and situations that trigger the old conditioning and make you want to slip back into performing just to feel belonging again. But you won't, because you've tasted the difference between living as your false self and living as your true self. And that difference is so vast, so undeniable, that going back becomes genuinely impossible. Not difficult, impossible. So why endure all of this? Why walk willingly into the recognition, shock, the dissolution, the void, the integration, the long road to sovereignty? Jung would tell you something uncomfortable. You don't actually have a choice, not a real one. Because once you've seen that you've been performing a false self your entire life, you cannot unsee it. You can try to resume the performance consciously, but now you'll feel the betrayal of yourself in every single moment. That knowledge will poison you slowly, silently, from the inside out. The pain of becoming yourself is real. It is devastating. It costs you relationships, opportunities, belonging, the comfort of fitting in. But Jung discovered something that makes the pain survivable. The pain of remaining your false self is actually worse. It's just more familiar. You've been enduring that particular suffering for so long that you've normalized it completely. You don't even register it as pain anymore. You think it's just what life feels like. That low-grade deadness, that persistent sense that something essential is missing, that quiet desperation you've learned to call normal. But when you start becoming your true self, you finally feel the contrast. And once you feel it, you understand what Jung meant when he said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not because it's easy or comfortable or leads to any version of success the world recognizes, because it's the only way to be genuinely alive while you're still breathing. Everything else is just rehearsal for a life you never actually live, and performing until you die. That, Jung would tell you, is the real tragedy, not the pain of transformation. The tragedy of never transforming at all. If you're in the pain of becoming yourself right now, if you're in any of these stages, feeling like you're losing everything and everyone, Jung would tell you this. You're not broken. You're not making mistakes. You're not losing your mind. You're losing the false mind. You're dismantling the constructed self that was suffocating the real one. You're enduring a death that must happen before authentic life can begin. And every person who is disturbed by your transformation is disturbed because your authenticity threatens their own performance. Your truth makes their compromises visible. Your courage exposes the fear they've chosen to live with. Your willingness to stand alone rather than live a lie makes their own choice unbearable to look at. Keep going, not because it gets easier. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Keep going because the alternative is spending the rest of your life being someone you're not, for people who don't actually know you, in a life that was never really yours. Keep going because you've already paid so much of the cost that turning back now would make all that suffering meaningless. Keep going because somewhere on the other side of this long, brutal, sacred process is a version of you that is genuinely alive, genuinely present, genuinely real. And that person, the one you're becoming, is worth every relationship you'll lose, every expectation you'll shatter, every comfortable role you'll shed, and never pick up again. The pain of becoming your true self is the most sacred pain a human being can experience, because it's the pain of being born, not the physical birth that happened to you, the psychological birth that you choose, the emergence of the person you always were underneath the person the world taught you to be. Jung spent his entire career documenting this process not to romanticize it, but to validate it for every person going through it alone. To tell them that the pain is not a sign of failure, it's proof they're doing something profound, something most people will never have the honesty to attempt. You're becoming yourself, and that is the most painful, most necessary, most worthwhile thing a human being can do. Welcome to the death of who you were. Welcome to the birth of who you are. Welcome to the rest of your life, lived finally on your own terms, aligned with your own truth, regardless of who refuses to understand. This is individuation. This is freedom. This is what Jung meant when he talked about wholeness, not perfection, not peace, not painlessness. Just finally, irreversibly, undeniably real. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.